Welcome to today's audio lecture on clarity and concision. In this lecture, we will discuss 4 topics. First, we'll define our terms. What do clarity and concision mean? Next, we'll discuss some tips for writing clearly. Then we'll discuss some tips for writing concisely. And finally, we'll talk about how you can put these tips to work in your writing. Let's start by defining our terms. The first thing we should note is that clarity and concision are sentence-level style principles. They enhance your writing at the level of the sentence. Clarity principles make your sentences easier to read and to understand, and concision principles make your sentences feel shorter. They may help you reduce your word count, but most importantly, they will make your writing easier to read quickly. Now let's turn to some concrete tips for writing more clearly. My broadest tip is this: to ensure that every sentence you write answers this question in this order. Who does what to whom? If your sentence answers this question in this order, your sentence will almost certainly be clear for reasons that will make sense momentarily. But if that tip is too broad, perhaps these tips will be more useful to you. To ensure that your writing is clear and easy to read, use concrete subjects. Prefer active voice to passive voice. Avoid buried verbs. Avoid negative language like not or un, and avoid inactive verbs. Now, if any of these terms are unfamiliar to you, and I assume that they will be unfamiliar to many of you, worry not, we will be defining these terms momentarily. So let's dive into these tips one by one, beginning with the importance of using concrete subjects. Concrete subjects are more or less what their name suggests. They're subjects that consist of people, places, or things that actually exist. People, places, or things that are capable of action. And so whenever possible, we want to use these concrete subjects, these people, places, and things capable of action as the subject of our sentences. But we also want to be wary of common style errors that oftentimes result in sentences that lack concrete subjects. These common style errors include dummy subjects and vague pronouns. Dummy subjects are placeholder subjects. They're short phrases that occupy the subject position in a sentence, but which are not concrete. They don't actually represent a person, place, or thing capable of action. Typically, dummy subjects will consist of the word it or there, followed by some version of the verb to be. Here are 2 examples of sentences that contain dummy subjects. Both of these sentences start with dummy subjects. In the first sentence, it is a dummy subject, and in the second sentence, there are is a dummy subject. Please note that in both of these sentences, it and there are mere placeholders. It and there do not represent a person, place, or thing capable of action. It and there are not the subjects that are responsible for the action of the sentence. They are, again, mere placeholders. To fix these sentences, we merely need to replace the dummy subjects with concrete subjects. And so in the first sentence, we replace it is with we, and in the second, we replace there are with you. In both cases, we've taken a placeholder and replaced it with a person, place, or thing capable of action. Dummy subjects are a problem for several reasons. First, they are vague. They are a departure from the concrete subjects, which make the most effective subjects for sentences. Second, they're oftentimes wordy. We can usually find a more economical way to express the sentiments contained in sentences that begin with dummy subjects. And finally, dummy subjects oftentimes lead to passive voice, which we will be discussing momentarily. And finally, to close out our discussion of dummy subjects, I will reiterate for perhaps the 3rd or 4th time that the best way to fix a dummy subject is to replace it with a person, place, or thing capable of action. Now let's move on to vague pronouns, the other common style error that typically results in sentences that lack a concrete subject. Vague pronouns, as their name suggests, are pronouns that lack clear reference. Any pronoun can be a vague pronoun, but the most common vague pronouns are typically this, that, these, and those when they are unaccompanied by a subsequent noun. For example, these two sentences begin with the words this and those respectively, and in both sentences, this and those are not followed by a noun which would help clarify what this and those refer to. And so to fix these sentences, all that we need to do is just put that noun after the vague pronoun so that the sentences would read, this initiative indicates a return to, and those solutions will not do. It's that easy. Now, to summarize, vague pronouns are a problem because they confuse readers. It's oftentimes unclear what they refer to. They slow readers down because they force your readers to look back at previous sentences to infer the meaning of the vague pronoun. And they can also be used to oversimplify ideas, such as when we use this, that, these, or those to stand in for an entire concept or sentence. But while vague pronouns are problematic for a wide variety of reasons, they're ultimately quite easy to fix. All you need to do is put a noun after this, that, these, or those to clarify what the vague pronoun refers to. Now let's move on to our next clarity principle, the importance of preferring active voice to passive voice. To follow this principle, you should try whenever possible to describe events using a logical cause-effect chronology, not just in your overall documents and descriptions, but in individual sentences. If you use this cause-effect chronology in individual sentences, you will, by definition, be writing in the active voice, because active voice describes sentences that start with the actor, proceed to the action, and end with the recipient of the action. Consider, for instance, this example of an active voice sentence. It begins with the actor, the state agencies, it moves on to the action, implemented, and it concludes with the recipient of the action, the program. In passive voice sentences, by contrast, action moves in the opposite direction. Passive voice sentences begin with the recipient of the action and then move on to the action itself. And then, passive voice sentences may omit the identity of the actor altogether. If they do include the identity of the actor appears at the end of the sentence, not at the beginning, as in active voice. On this slide, you can see passive voice at work. We've taken the active voice example that we used previously, and we've flipped the order of the sentence around. Now the program, the recipient of the action, the implementation, appears at the beginning of the sentence. We then move on to the action itself, was implemented, and we conclude with by the state agencies. But I put by the state agencies in parentheses to indicate that we could omit the state agencies from the sentence altogether, and the sentence would still make sense. Now, passive voice is a problem for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest problems with passive voice is that it allows writers to omit the subject of a sentence, the person, place, or thing responsible for action, as we did in the previous example. This leads to sentences that are vague and that are indirect. But by far a bigger problem with passive voice is that it inverts a sentence's logical cause-effect chronology. For native English language speakers, that logical cause-effect chronology, that movement from actor to action to the recipient of the action, it just feels right. It just makes sense. And it feels right and makes sense because that is, after all, the default sentence structure in English. It is the first sentence structure we learn when we're children. And so when we're writing for clarity, when we're trying to make our point as plain and clear as possible, we want to use the most foundational structures of the language, and in English, that means using the active voice. To detect instances of passive voice in your writing, you can, of course, think about who is responsible for the action, what is the action, who's receiving the action. You can, in short, take a very grammatical or stylistic approach to detecting passive voice. But you can also use the zombies test. The zombies test is a simple and easy test to detect passive voice. Basically, the way it works is as follows. You read a sentence. You identify the primary verb in the sentence. You put the phrase by zombies after that verb, immediately following that verb. And if the sentence makes grammatical sense, not logical sense, but grammatical sense, up to and including the phrase by zombies, then your sentence is indeed written in passive voice. Nevertheless, I don't want you coming away from this audio lecture thinking that passive voice is somehow evil, that it should be banished from your writing. No, passive voice, it exists for a reason. We should use it sparingly, but we can use it nonetheless. We just need to know when to use it. One instance in which it's appropriate to use passive voice is when the object of a sentence is more important than its subject. Consider, for instance, this sentence. The cost was calculated to exceed $5 million. In this sentence, it's not really important who did the calculating. What is important is that the cost was calculated to exceed $5 million. And so in this instance, there's no real downside to omitting the actor. We don't need to know who the actor is. Incidentally, this is one of the main reasons why a lot of scientific literature is oftentimes written in passive voice, because the identity of the researcher is either implied by the authorship of the article, or it's far less important than the outcome of the experiment or the research. Passive voice is also useful and permissible in instances when you want to avoid assigning or taking blame. Imagine, for instance, that an intern incorrectly archived some files and that it caused a big administrative malfunction in your company. That's obviously a problem, but you also want to be sensitive to the fact that your intern is just learning the ropes. You really don't want to throw them under the bus. And so when describing the incident, you might use passive voice strategically to avoid assigning blame to the intern in question. Okay, enough about active voice and passive voice. Now let's talk about buried verbs and why you should avoid them. Before we define buried verbs, however, I want to make a general point about language which will help us understand why buried verbs are such a problem. The general point is this, that verbs are stronger words than nouns, and that as such we should always seek to load our sentences with as many verbs as possible while minimizing nouns. This is because we have an easier time visualizing and remembering action than we do visualizing or remembering people, places, and things. One of the easiest ways to maximize the number of verbs in our writing is by identifying all of the buried verbs in our sentences and digging them back up, as it were. And that's because buried verbs are verbs that have been converted into nouns, typically using an ION or MENT suffix. To better understand how we can maximize the number of verbs in our writing, let's take a look at two sample sentences. And in both of these sentences, I've gone ahead and highlighted some problematic words or phrases. Now, we can probably guess right off the bat that transformation, communication, and consideration are all buried verbs. And we can guess that they're buried verbs because they all end in ION suffixes. Analysis is also a buried verb. We've taken the verb to analyze and turned it into a noun. And then it is of course a dummy subject. So how can we fix this? We can fix these issues by identifying the verb that has been buried within analysis, transformation, communication, and consideration, and by replacing the dummy subject it is with a concrete subject. So we've already said that analyze is the verb buried within analysis. We can guess that transform is the verb buried within transformation. We can guess that communicate is the verb buried within communication, and that consider is the verb buried within consideration. And once we've identified the verbs that have been buried within these nouns, we're more than halfway to our goal. Now we just need to reorganize the sentence to incorporate those verbs. And so the first sentence would read, he analyzed changes in how we communicate. And the second one would read, we must consider all financial factors. Note that we've replaced that dummy subject, it is, with a concrete subject, we, a person, place, or thing capable of action. Now, to bring our conversation about buried verbs to a conclusion, I just want to emphasize why they're a problem. They are a problem because verbs are more memorable than nouns, and perhaps most importantly because readers hate ION words. Those ION words and MENT words, they oftentimes sound jargony, and they oftentimes are just deeply, deeply alienating. So, as much as possible, avoid them and activate your writing by maximizing the number of verbs in your sentences. And finally, let's round out our conversation about clarity with our two advanced clarity techniques, avoiding negative language and avoiding inactive verbs. I've described these techniques as advanced clarity techniques for two different reasons. First, I've described them as such because you're far less likely to lose points for either of these clarity errors than for the other categories of clarity errors. And secondly, I've described them as such because they're far less important than the three previous clarity techniques. Once you've mastered the three previous clarity techniques, using concrete subjects, avoiding passive voice, avoiding buried verbs, then by all means turn your attention to avoiding negative language and avoiding inactive verbs. But these clarity techniques, while important, while useful, make far less of a difference in the quality of your writing than the three previous clarity techniques. Still, these techniques are important and useful to know, so let's dig in. As with the other clarity techniques, I want to begin by telling you what to do rather than what to avoid. And in this case, I would encourage you to frame your sentences positively and use active verbs. These are verbs of action as opposed to verbs of being or possession, the latter including verbs like to be and to have. We frame our language positively and we write using active verbs for two main reasons. First, because negative language, language that uses not or un, is indirect and it's easy to understand. By definition, when you're using negative language, you're taking an indirect path to your meaning. You're saying what something is not rather than what it is. And also, you're using little words that your reader can very easily overlook. We've all read a sentence, come to the end of a sentence and found ourselves confused about the meaning, only to look back at the sentence and realize that the reason we were confused is that we overlooked an instance of not or un. Don't let this happen in your own writing. Whenever possible, frame things positively by avoiding the words not or un. Passive verbs, meanwhile, are a problem because when we overuse them, they make our writing boring, static, and lifeless. Think about it. When I say the verb to be or the verb to have, you don't envision someone acting or moving in your brain, right? These are actions, but they're not actions that entail movement or dynamism. And so if you overload your language with these kinds of verbs, your writing will become boring, static, and lifeless. Now, this is not to suggest that you should banish verbs of being or verbs of possession from your vocabulary. You can't. They are indispensable. We need these verbs. There's a reason why these are the first verbs we learn, not only in our own language, but in any other language that we acquire along the way. We cannot do without them. But if you have a good, elegant way to replace one of these verbs of being or possession, with a more active, a more dynamic verb, then do it. It will make your writing significantly more engaging. Okay, enough about clarity. Now let's move on to tips for writing concisely. My most important tip is this: don't obsess over word count. Instead, focus on making your writing easy to read quickly. That is the real secret of concision. How do we do this? How do we make our writing feel shorter? How do we make it easy to read quickly? That's a good question. Fortunately, we've got some easy to follow tips to help us achieve this goal. We can follow the clarity tips from this lecture. That's right, clarity is one of the secrets of concision. We can keep our sentences short. We can minimize modifiers. We can eliminate redundant language, and we can avoid evasive or obvious statements. Let's start with the familiar, following the clarity tips from this lecture. But why does this work? Why is clarity a secret to concision? Clarity is a secret to concision because clear writing is easy to read, and writing that is easy to read is easy to read quickly. If you write clearly, your messages will feel shorter as a result. My next tip is similarly straightforward. Keep your sentences short. Keeping your sentences short is an important component of concision because long sentences slow your reader down. And so if you see a sentence that is 2 lines or longer, go ahead and chop it up. It's that simple. Short sentences are easy to read, and so if you chop up long sentences, your document will feel shorter to your readers. Next up on our concision tips, minimize modifiers. Like many of our previous concision tips, minimizing modifiers is pretty easy to follow. One of the first things that you can do to follow this step is look for amplifiers like very or really. If you see these kinds of words, cut them out. Similarly, if you find yourself using more than one adjective or adverb per noun or verb, limit yourself to your most powerful adjective or adverb. Following this step is a really easy way to minimize word count, and it's pretty much cost-free. It's cost-free because amplifiers are unconvincing. Your readers are unlikely to be convinced of an argument just because you include a number of reallys and veries as part of it. Similarly, if you overuse adjectives and adverbs, your readers grow numb. And so by limiting yourself to only your most powerful adjectives and adverbs, you're cutting word count while doing very little to actually alter the way that your readers will encounter and interpret your writing. Next, let's talk about how you can eliminate redundant language in your writing. Now, to begin with, we should acknowledge that redundant language takes many forms. There are all kinds of passages in your writing that, if you really think about it, you can cut without altering the substance of your writing. But we should nevertheless be particularly sensitive to 2 common forms of redundant language, including redundant pairs and redundant modifiers. Redundant pairs are just what their name suggests. They're pairs of modifiers that mean the same thing. Redundant modifiers, on the other hand, are 2-word phrases that contain both a modifier, or an adjective, and a noun, in which the adjective or modifier means basically the same thing as the noun. These include phrases like future plans, completely finish, end result, each individual, important essentials, etc. Fortunately for us, fixing redundant pairs and redundant modifiers is quite easy. In the case of redundant pairs, just eliminate 1/2 of the pair. Take first and foremost. You can keep first and eliminate foremost, or keep foremost and eliminate first. Either one is fine, just get rid of 1/2 of the pair. In the case of redundant modifiers, on the other hand, just get rid of the adjective or modifier and keep the noun. So in the instance of future plans, you would get rid of future and keep plans. In the case of completely finish, you would get rid of completely and keep finish, and so on and so forth. Getting rid of these redundant pairs and redundant modifiers is important because this language is pointless, and at least in writing, this redundant language makes your message sound pompous. Redundant pairs, redundant modifiers, these are normal parts of oral English, but in written English, they do sound a bit legalistic and therefore a bit pompous. So get rid of them wherever you can. Now on to our final concision tip: avoid evasive or obvious statements. As with our previous tip, we have two common forms of errors that we need to look out for when we're looking out for evasive or obvious statements. These two errors include hedging and metadiscourse. Hedging, on the one hand, is when you qualify or downgrade an otherwise definitive statement. Now, not surprisingly, hedging can take many forms, but most commonly it consists of sentences that include phrases like I think, I feel, or I believe, oftentimes at the beginning of a sentence or a clause. Now, I'm not suggesting that you banish think, feel, or believe from your vocabulary. Instead, just reserve these words for sentences that are legitimately about thinking, feeling, or believing. Do not tack them on to the beginning of sentences that are about something else entirely. Hedging is a problem for a number of different reasons, but it's mainly a problem because it's a waste of words and because it makes you sound less confident. It takes an affirmative, definitive statement and downgrades it to something equivocal. Metadiscourse, on the other hand, is writing about writing or speaking about speaking. The most common forms of metadiscourse are phrases like, I'm writing to inform you that, or the purpose of this email is. And statements like this are a problem because they're obvious. If you're writing an email, for instance, to invite me to an upcoming meeting, then that invitation is by definition the purpose of the message. You don't need to preface your message with a statement that says, I'm writing to invite you to an upcoming meeting. When you find instances of metadiscourse in your writing, consider replacing them with polite calls to action. Instead of writing, I'm writing to inform you about an upcoming meeting, replace it with, please consider attending the upcoming meeting in room 223B at 4 p.m. this Friday. Polite calls to action are almost always a superior alternative to metadiscourse. Finally, let's bring this audio lecture to a close by discussing how we can put these clarity and concision tips into practice. And the main point I want to make here is that all of these tips are guidelines. They are not rules. They are not rigidly right or wrong. These are just tips for how, under most circumstances, you can make your writing clearer and easier to read quickly. At the end of the day, writing is all about choices. It's about what words you choose. It's about what structure you choose. And yes, it's about what style principles you choose. And so, in short, you should not always rigidly adhere to these guidelines. You should follow them when they make sense. You should follow them when they seem like, in your judgment, they represent the best choice, the best way to achieve your communication goals and to enhance your writing. But if you believe that violating one of these guidelines is the best way to achieve your goals, that doing so will make your document better, clearer, and easier to read, then by all means, do it. And that, friends, brings us to the end of this audio lecture. To reiterate, clarity and concision principles are primarily aimed at enhancing your writing at the level of the sentence. Clarity principles do so by making your writing clearer, by making it easier to read and understand. And concision principles do so by making your writing feel shorter. Thanks as always for listening.